The morning started like any other Tuesday in downtown Chicago. People rushed to work with their coffee cups, taxis honked at every corner, and the city buzzed with its usual energy. But inside courtroom 4B of the federal courthouse, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Robert Chen sat at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him, trying to look calm. But anyone who looked closely could see the slight tremor in his fingers. This was the man who had graced the cover of Fortune magazine 3 times, the same man whose tech company had created medical devices that saved thousands of lives every year, the billionaire who everyone said had the Midas touch. Now he sat alone, watching his entire world fall apart. Just 6 months ago, Robert's life was perfect. He lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. His company's stock was at an all-time high. Hospitals around the world used his inventions. He employed over 5,000 people and donated millions to charity every year. People respected him. They wanted to be him, but then came the accusations. His own chief financial officer, a man named Vincent Liu, who Robert had trusted for 12 years, had gone to the FBI with documents, financial records, email chains, bank statements, all of it pointing to one terrible conclusion. Robert Chen had been stealing money from his own charitable foundation. Millions of dollars that were supposed to help sick children were allegedly going into secret offshore accounts. The media went crazy. Every news channel ran the story. Billionaire betrayal, the headlines screamed. Tech titans fall from grace. His face was everywhere, but now people looked at him with disgust instead of admiration. His board of directors held an emergency meeting and asked him to step down. His investors pulled out. His friends stopped returning his calls. The worst part? Robert was completely innocent. He had no idea how Vincent had done it, but someone had forged his signatures on documents, created fake email accounts that looked like his, set up shell companies in his name. It was brilliant and devastating. And now Robert sat in a federal courtroom, facing 20 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. His lawyer, Theodore Park, had been with him since the beginning. They'd worked together for 15 years. Theodore handled every major deal, every contract, every legal matter for Robert's company. He was more than a lawyer. He was a friend. Or at least Robert thought he was. The prosecution had just finished presenting their opening evidence. Box after box of documents, financial records that looked damning, email printouts, bank transfers with Robert's name all over them. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 50s named District Attorney Morrison, laid it all out with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she had said, her voice filled with righteous anger, "we will prove beyond any doubt that Robert Chen systematically stole $47 million from the Chen Foundation for Children's Medicine. Money that parents donated to help their sick children. Money that corporations gave in good faith. Money that was supposed to fund research, buy medical equipment, and save lives. Instead, this man used it to buy another yacht, another vacation home, another luxury car." Robert wanted to stand up and scream that it wasn't true, but Theodore had told him to stay quiet, stay calm, let the defense do the talking. The judge, a stern-looking man named Judge William Harrison, called for a 15-minute recess. Robert stood up, his legs feeling weak. Theodore grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the hallway outside the courtroom. The hallway was crowded with reporters, all of them trying to get a statement. Security guards pushed them back as Theodore rushed Robert toward a small conference room reserved for attorney-client meetings. Once inside, Theodore closed the door and leaned against it. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. "Theodore," Robert said, confused by his lawyer's behavior. "What's wrong?" "We knew they'd present their case. We have our defense ready. We have the forensic accountant who can prove those signatures were forged. We have—" "I can't do this," Theodore interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert stared at him. "What?" "I can't defend you." Theodore looked at the floor, unable to meet Robert's eyes. "Those emails they showed, the ones with your signature, I can't explain them. And if I continue as your lawyer, if I defend you and you're found guilty, my firm will be destroyed. The Bar Association will question everything. My other clients will leave. My partners have already called me twice during the prosecution's opening." Robert felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You're joking." "I'm sorry." Theodore finally looked up and Robert could see genuine fear in his eyes. "You need to understand. If I go down with you, my whole career is over. My family's future is over. I have 2 kids in college. I have a mortgage. You have a client who's innocent. Robert's voice rose. I trusted you. For 15 years, I trusted you. The evidence is overwhelming. Theodore was already backing toward the door. Maybe you should consider a plea deal. Morrison mentioned it. If you plead guilty, they'll reduce the sentence to maybe 5 years instead of 20. With good behavior, you could be out in 3. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. Then find another lawyer. Theodore opened the door. I'm sorry, Robert. I really am. But I have to think about my own family. And just like that, he was gone. Robert stood alone in the small conference room, trying to process what had just happened. His lawyer, the man he'd paid millions in fees over the years, had abandoned him. Right in the middle of his trial. Right when he needed help the most. He looked at his watch. The recess would be over in 8 minutes. He had to go back into that courtroom. He had to face the jury, the judge, the prosecutor who was determined to destroy him, and now he had to do it alone. Robert walked back into the hallway in a daze. The reporters shouted questions at him, but their voices sounded far away like he was underwater. Security cleared a path and Robert made his way back toward the courtroom doors. That's when he saw her. Grace Williams stood near the courtroom entrance, holding a small brown paper bag. She wore her usual uniform, a simple gray dress with a white apron, comfortable shoes, and her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd worked as a housekeeper in Robert's building for the past 3 years. She cleaned his penthouse twice a week. She was always polite, always professional, always thorough in her work. Robert had barely noticed her most of the time, if he was being honest. She was just part of the background of his busy life, someone who made sure his home was clean while he focused on running his empire. But now she was here, in the courthouse, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Mr. Chen, she said quietly as he walked past. He stopped. Grace, what are you doing here? I brought you lunch. She held up the paper bag. I figured with the trial and everything, you might not have time to eat. It's just a turkey sandwich and some fruit. Nothing fancy. Robert was so stunned by this simple gesture of kindness that he couldn't speak for a moment. This woman, who he paid $20 an hour to clean his apartment, had taken time off from work to bring him lunch. Meanwhile, his lawyer, who he'd paid millions, had just walked away. That's very kind of you, he managed to say. Thank you. Grace nodded, then hesitated. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Is everything okay? Robert asked. I've been following the trial on the news, she said carefully. And I just want you to know, I don't believe what they're saying about you. Robert felt a sudden tightness in his chest. This woman barely knew him. She cleaned his apartment and they'd had maybe a dozen brief conversations in 3 years. Yet she was the only person who'd said those words to him in months. Why? He asked. Why don't you believe it? Grace looked him directly in the eyes. Because I've cleaned your home for 3 years, Mr. Chen. I've seen your personal papers, your mail, your calendar. I've never seen anything that made me think you were a bad person. I've seen the thank you letters from families whose children were helped by your foundation. I've seen you working at midnight on proposals for new medical equipment. I've seen you donate your time to hospital fundraisers. A man who does all that doesn't steal from sick children. Robert felt tears threatening to form, but he blinked them back. My lawyer just quit, he said, not knowing why he was telling her this. Right now, during the recess, he said the evidence is too strong and he can't defend me without risking his career. Grace's eyes widened. He what? I have to go back in there in about 3 minutes. And I don't have a lawyer anymore. They stood there in the crowded hallway, this billionaire businessman and this cleaning woman, and for a moment the noise around them seemed to fade away. Then Grace did something that would change everything. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin and said, Then I'll defend you. Robert actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. Grace, that's impossible. You're not a lawyer. You can't just— I know I'm not a lawyer, she interrupted, but I have eyes and ears and a brain, and I've been paying attention. I watched the prosecution's opening on the courthouse TV screen while I was waiting. I heard what they said, and Mr. Chen, I've been in your home. I've cleaned your office. I've organized your files. I know things about your daily routine and your habits that might be important. The judge won't allow it. You're not certified to practice law. Then let me sit with you at the defense table as your assistant. Let me help you question witnesses. Let me find the inconsistencies in their story. Grace's voice was getting stronger, more confident. I may not have gone to law school, but I've been poor my whole life. I've had to fight for everything. I've represented myself in housing court, in small claims court, in disputes with my landlord. I know how to stand up and argue when something isn't right. Robert stared at this woman he'd barely noticed for 3 years. She was maybe 50 years old with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She made minimum wage cleaning other people's homes. She had no legal training and no business being anywhere near a federal courtroom, but she was the only person offering to help him. "Why would you do this?" he asked quietly. "Why would you risk your time and energy for me?" Grace smiled a little. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I raised 3 children on my own after my husband died. I worked 2 jobs for 15 years to put food on the table. I've cleaned houses, worked in restaurants, done whatever I had to do. And you know what I learned? Rich people, poor people, doesn't matter. What matters is character. And you have good character, Mr. Chen, I've seen it." The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door. "Court is resuming in 1 minute. Robert looked at Grace. This was insane. This would never work. The judge would probably throw them both out. But what choice did he have? "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." They walked into the courtroom together and every head turned to watch. Robert took his seat at the defense table, and Grace sat down next to him, placing her brown paper bag carefully on the floor. Judge Harrison looked up from his papers and frowned. "Mr. Chen, where is Mr. Park?" Robert stood up, his heart pounding. "Your Honor, my attorney has withdrawn from the case. I'm requesting that Ms. Grace Williams be allowed to assist me in my defense as a legal assistant and advisor." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor looked shocked. The judge's frown deepened. "Ms. Williams," Judge Harrison said, "are you a licensed attorney?" Grace stood up and Robert noticed that she didn't look nervous at all. "No, Your Honor, I am not. I'm a housekeeper. But I've worked in Mr. Chen's home for 3 years, and I have personal knowledge about his character and daily activities that may be relevant to this case. And the 6th Amendment guarantees Mr. Chen the right to assistance in his defense." Judge Harrison studied her for a long moment. The entire courtroom held its breath. Finally, the judge spoke. "This is highly irregular, but Mr. Chen has the right to represent himself if he chooses, and he may have an advisor assist him. Ms. Williams, you may not address the court directly, question witnesses, or make legal arguments. You may only advise Mr. Chen, is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Grace said. "Very well." Judge Harrison looked at Robert. "Mr. Chen, I hope you understand what you're doing. We'll proceed with the trial. The prosecution may call their first witness." District Attorney Morrison stood up, still looking stunned by this turn of events. But then a small smile crossed her face. She probably thought this made her job easier. A billionaire defending himself with the help of his cleaning lady? This trial just became a sure win for the prosecution. But as Robert sat back down and Grace leaned over to whisper in his ear, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope District Attorney Morrison called her first witness with the confidence of someone who knew they'd already won. The prosecution calls Vincent Liu to the stand. Robert felt his stomach drop as his former CFO walked to the witness stand. Vincent looked calm, almost peaceful. He wore an expensive suit and walked with his shoulders back like a man with nothing to hide. This was the person Robert had trusted with every financial decision in his company. The man he'd promoted, given bonuses to, invited to his home for dinner parties. The man who had destroyed his life. Grace leaned close to Robert and whispered, "Watch his hands. My mom always said a liar's hands tell the truth even when their mouth doesn't." Vincent was sworn in and took his seat. Morrison approached him with a gentle smile like they were old friends having a casual conversation. "Mr. Liu, how long did you work for Robert Chen?" 12 years, Vincent answered smoothly. "I started as a senior accountant and worked my way up to chief financial officer. And during those 12 years, would you say you had a good relationship with Mr. Chen?" "I thought so. I considered him a friend, actually. Which makes what I discovered even more painful." Robert gritted his teeth. Grace put a hand on his arm, a quiet reminder to stay calm. Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Tell us what you discovered, Mr. Liu." Vincent took a deep breath like this was difficult for him. Robert wanted to jump over the table. "About 8 months ago, I noticed some irregularities in the foundation's accounts. Small things at first, transfers that didn't quite match up with the paperwork. I thought it was just errors, you know? We handle millions of dollars, so sometimes things get miscoded. But it wasn't just errors, was it?" "No." Vincent shook his head sadly. The more I looked, the more I found. Money was being moved from the foundation into shell companies, then from those companies into offshore accounts. It was sophisticated. Whoever set it up knew what they were doing. And who had access to make those kinds of transfers? Only 2 people had the authorization codes and passwords needed. Myself and Robert Chen. The jury leaned forward, paying close attention. This was the heart of the prosecution's case. Did you make those transfers, Mr. Liu? Absolutely not. So if you didn't make them, who did? Vincent looked directly at Robert with what seemed like genuine sadness. It had to be Robert. There's no other explanation. Grace scribbled something on a notepad and pushed it to Robert. It said, "He's lying, but he's good at it. Ask him about the weekend trips." Robert frowned at her, confused. Grace pointed to the notepad more insistently. Morrison continued questioning Vincent for another 20 minutes, walking through bank statements, transfer records, and email chains. Everything pointed to Robert. The evidence looked airtight. Finally, Morrison finished. "Your witness, Mr. Chen, this was it." Robert had to question his former friend, the man who'd framed him. He'd never cross-examined anyone in his life. His hands were sweating. His mind was racing. He stood up slowly, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Grace gave him an encouraging nod. "Vincent," Robert began, and his voice came out stronger than he expected. "You said only 2 people had access to those accounts. You and me." "That's correct. But passwords can be stolen, can't they? Or hacked?" Vincent shrugged. "Theoretically, yes. But our system was very secure. And the transfers were made from your office computer, using your login credentials during hours when you were in the building. Security footage confirms it." Robert felt panic rising. That was true. The prosecution had shown the security footage earlier. But Grace was shaking her head slightly, like there was something wrong with that statement. "Let me ask you something else," Robert said, following his instinct. "In the 12 years you worked for me, did you ever take a vacation?" Vincent looked surprised by the question. "Of course. Everyone takes vacations. How many?" "I don't know, several. Why does that matter?" "Humor me. How many weeks of vacation did you take each year?" Morrison stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance?" Robert turned to the judge. "I'm establishing a pattern of behavior, Your Honor. It's relevant to Mr. Liu's credibility." Judge Harrison considered this. "I'll allow it, but get to your point, Mr. Chen." Vincent shifted in his seat the first time he'd looked uncomfortable. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks a year?" Grace scribbled again. "Company records. Check company records." Robert suddenly understood. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that the prosecution provide Mr. Liu's employment records, specifically his vacation time for the past 3 years. Morrison looked annoyed but nodded to her assistant, who began typing on a laptop. After a moment, she handed a paper to Morrison, who glanced at it and frowned. "According to these records," Morrison said reluctantly, "Mr. Liu took 6 weeks of vacation last year, 5 weeks the year before, and 7 weeks 3 years ago." The jury looked interested now. That was a lot of vacation time. Robert pressed forward. "Vincent, that's quite a bit of time off. Where did you go on these vacations?" "Various places. Europe mostly. Sometimes Asia. I like to travel. On a CFO's salary, those trips must have been expensive. I'm good with money. I save," Grace wrote. "Bank records." "His bank records." "Your Honor," Robert said, "I request that Mr. Liu's personal bank records be examined. If he's been taking expensive international trips multiple times a year, there should be a clear record of how he paid for them." Morrison stood up quickly. "Your Honor, Mr. Liu is not on trial here. His personal finances are not relevant. They are if he's accusing me of stealing money while he himself has been living beyond his means," Robert argued. "It goes to his credibility and possible motive." Judge Harrison thought for a moment. "I'm going to allow a limited review of Mr. Liu's financial records for the time period in question. We'll recess for the day while this information is gathered. Court will resume tomorrow morning at 9. The gavel came down and everyone stood as the judge left. Robert turned to Grace, amazed. "How did you know about the vacations?" Grace smiled a little. "I clean your office, remember? I've seen the staff schedule board. Vincent was always taking time off, and I wondered how he afforded it. My daughter works in banking, and she always says follow the money. If Vincent is framing you for stealing money, maybe it's because he's the one who actually stole it." Robert sat down heavily. "That's brilliant. That's actually brilliant." "Don't celebrate yet," Grace said. "We still have to prove it." And rich people take vacations all the time. The jury might not think it's suspicious, but it's a start. It's more than I had an hour ago. They gathered their things and headed for the exit. The reporters swarmed again, shouting questions. Robert ignored them, but then one question cut through the noise. "Mr. Chen, is it true your lawyer abandoned you? Are you really being defended by your maid?" Robert stopped. He looked at the reporter, then at Grace beside him. She kept her head high, dignified despite the insulting way the question was phrased. "Ms. Williams is not just my maid," Robert said clearly. "She's the only person who had the courage to stand beside me when everyone else walked away. She's brilliant, observant, and has more integrity in her little finger than most lawyers have in their entire career. So yes, she's helping me, and I'm grateful for it." Grace's eyes glistened a little, but she didn't cry. She just nodded once and walked beside him out of the courthouse. That evening, Robert sat in his penthouse, which felt emptier than ever. Most of his staff had quit. His friends had disappeared. Even his sister had stopped calling, too embarrassed by the scandal to be associated with him. There was a knock on the door. He opened it to find Grace standing there with 2 grocery bags. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "You haven't been eating properly," she said, walking past him into the kitchen. "I can tell just by looking at you. You've lost weight. When did you last have a real meal?" Robert couldn't remember. "Grace, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She started unpacking the bags. "Fresh vegetables, chicken, rice, spices. My grandmother used to say you can't fight a battle on an empty stomach. So sit down and let me cook. We also need to prepare for tomorrow." While Grace cooked, Robert sat at the kitchen counter with his laptop going through files. Grace moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and soon the smell of home-cooked food filled the apartment. It had been months since Robert had smelled anything like it. "Tell me about Vincent," Grace said while she chopped vegetables. "What was he like before all this? What kind of person?" Robert thought about it. Ambitious. Very ambitious. Always working on side projects, talking about making it big someday. He used to joke about being poor growing up, how he never wanted to go back to that life. So money was important to him. Very. "And did you pay him well?" "Very well. 6 figures plus bonuses." Grace nodded, stirring something on the stove. "But maybe not well enough for the life he wanted. Maybe he saw all your wealth and thought he deserved a piece of it. I trusted him with everything. That's what made you vulnerable." Grace brought him a plate of food: roasted chicken, rice, vegetables. It looked and smelled incredible. "Trust is a beautiful thing, Mr. Chen, but some people see it as weakness to exploit." They ate together, and Robert realized this was the first time in months he'd had a meal with another person. Everyone else had abandoned him, but this woman who barely knew him was sitting in his kitchen, feeding him, helping him fight for his life. "Why are you really doing this?" Robert asked quietly. "The truth." Grace set down her fork and looked at him directly. "When I was 23 years old, my husband died in a car accident. We had 3 babies under the age of 5. I had no education, no skills, no money. And I was arrested." Robert's eyes widened. "What?" "Someone stole from the grocery store where I worked. They said it was me because I was the only one working that section. They had video footage of me near the register. They had missing cash. They had everything they needed to convict me." Grace's voice was steady, but Robert could hear the old pain in it. "I was assigned a public defender who barely looked at my case. He told me to plead guilty, take the deal, do 6 months in jail. I told him I didn't do it. He said nobody would believe me. What happened? I represented myself. I went through that video footage hour by hour until I found 5 seconds where you could see someone else's hand near the register, someone wearing a ring just like the manager's ring. I showed it to the judge. The charges were dropped." Grace looked at Robert with fierce eyes. "I know what it's like to be innocent and have everyone assume you're guilty. I know what it's like to be poor and powerless and have to fight alone. And I swore if I ever had the chance to help someone else in that situation, I would. Rich or poor doesn't matter. Wrong is wrong." Robert felt a lump in his throat. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just eat your food and get some rest. Tomorrow we have work to do." Grace stayed until late, and they went through documents together. She asked questions that Robert had never thought to ask. She noticed patterns that he'd missed. And slowly they began to build a defense. Around midnight, Grace's phone rang. She answered it, and Robert watched her face change from calm to worried. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll be there as soon as I can." She hung up and started gathering her things quickly. "What's wrong?" Robert asked. That was my daughter. My grandson is in the hospital. Asthma attack. He's stable now, but she needs me there. Of course, go. Family comes first. Grace paused at the door. Mr. Chen, I'll be back tomorrow morning before court. I promise. Grace, if you need to be with your family, I'll be there, she said firmly. Both places. Family takes care of family, and right now you're family too. She left and Robert stood alone in his penthouse. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone. He had an ally, an unexpected one maybe, an unlikely one definitely, but someone who believed in him, someone who was willing to fight. The next morning, Robert arrived at the courthouse early. The prosecution had submitted Vincent's financial records as ordered, and Robert had spent the night going through them. What he found was interesting. Very interesting. Grace arrived just as court was about to start, looking tired but determined. How's your grandson? Robert asked. He's okay. They're keeping him for observation. My daughter is with him. She set down her bag. Did you find anything? Look at this. Robert showed her the bank statements. Vincent's regular deposits match his salary. But look at these irregular deposits. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, 20,000. They don't come from our company. Grace leaned in, studying the numbers. Where do they come from? That's what we need to find out. Judge Harrison entered and everyone rose. The trial continued, and Morrison called her next witness, a forensic accountant who had traced the stolen money from the foundation to the offshore accounts. The accountant was professional and thorough. She showed charts and graphs demonstrating exactly how the money had moved, and every trail led back to Robert's authorization codes. When it was Robert's turn to question her, Grace whispered, "Ask her about the IP addresses." Robert didn't know what that meant, but he trusted Grace. "Ma'am, when these transfers were made, were they all made from the same computer?" The accountant checked her notes. "According to the logs, yes. The computer in Mr. Chen's office. And were they all made from the same IP address?" She frowned, checking again. "Actually, no. Most were from the office IP address, but several came from a different location. Can you tell where? It appears to be a residential address in Naperville, a suburb west of Chicago." Robert's heart started racing. "And who lives at that address?" The accountant looked uncomfortable. "I don't have that information." Grace scribbled rapidly and showed Robert. "Vincent lives in Naperville. Company records show his address." Robert turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that the court verify the address in question against Mr. Liu's residential address." Morrison stood up, looking worried now. "Your Honor, this is speculation." "It's not speculation if the addresses match," Robert said. "If transfers that allegedly came from my computer actually came from Mr. Liu's home, that changes everything." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Harrison looked intrigued. "I'll allow it. Bailiff, please verify." 5 minutes later, the answer came back. The IP address matched Vincent's home address exactly. The jury sat up straighter. This was no longer an open and shut case. Robert looked at Grace, who gave him a small nod. They weren't winning yet, but they were fighting back. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Robert Chen had hoped that the truth might actually come out. The courtroom erupted in noise. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The jury members looked at each other with raised eyebrows. District Attorney Morrison's face had gone pale, but she recovered quickly. "Your Honor," she said, standing up with forced confidence, "an IP address match doesn't prove anything. Mr. Liu was the CFO. He often worked from home. It's perfectly reasonable that he would access company systems remotely." Judge Harrison nodded. "That's a fair point. Mr. Chen, do you have a response?" Robert stood, feeling Grace's steady presence beside him. "Your Honor, if Mr. Liu was accessing the system legitimately for work purposes, there would be a record of his remote access requests. All employees need special authorization to access financial systems from outside the office. It's a security protocol." Morrison's assistant frantically typed on her laptop, then whispered something to Morrison. The prosecutor's expression tightened. "Your Honor," Robert continued, "I'd like to request the remote access logs for the dates when these suspicious transfers occurred." Judge Harrison looked at Morrison. "Does the prosecution have those logs?" Morrison hesitated. "We'll need to request them from the company's IT department, then request them. This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. We'll review the logs then." The judge's gavel came down hard. As people filed out of the courtroom, Robert heard the whispers. The tide was beginning to turn. What had seemed like a sure conviction was now looking shakier. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed even more aggressively than before. Mr. Chen, does this mean Vincent Liu framed you? Are you saying your CFO is the real criminal? Ms. Williams, how did you know to look for the IP addresses? Grace handled it with surprising grace, simply saying, "The truth always leaves traces. You just have to know where to look." Then she gently guided Robert through the crowd to a waiting taxi. Once inside the cab, Robert let out a long breath. That was incredible. How did you know about the IP addresses? Grace smiled tiredly. My son works in IT. He's always talking about computer security, IP addresses, digital footprints. I barely understand half of it, but I remember him saying that every computer leaves a trail. I figured if Vincent was sneaking into the system, maybe he did it from home where he felt safe. Your son works in IT? What about your daughter? She's a bank manager, and my youngest is in medical school. Grace's voice was full of quiet pride. I cleaned houses for 20 years to put them through college. Every single one of them tried to help me retire, but I told them I like working. Keeps me busy. Gives me purpose. Robert looked at this woman with new understanding. She'd raised 3 successful children alone, worked multiple jobs, and somehow maintained the strength to help a stranger fight for his life. You're remarkable, he said quietly. Grace waved her hand dismissively. I just did what any mother would do. Now we need to prepare for tomorrow. Those access logs are going to be important. They spent the evening in Robert's office at his apartment building. The company had locked him out of the main headquarters, but he still had files and backup records at home. Grace made coffee and sandwiches while Robert dug through old IT security reports. Around 8 o'clock, Grace's phone rang. She stepped out to take the call, and when she came back, Robert could see she'd been crying. What happened? He asked, alarmed. Grace sat down slowly. That was the hospital. My grandson's condition got worse. They're moving him to intensive care. Grace, go. Please, be with your family. But the trial doesn't matter as much as your grandson. Robert stood up and grabbed his coat. Come on, I'll drive you there. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. You've been taking care of me. Let me take care of you for once. They drove to the children's hospital across town. Grace was quiet during the drive, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Robert could see she was praying silently. At the hospital, Grace's daughter Patricia was in the waiting room. She was in her early 30s, wearing a bank employee's blazer and skirt, her eyes red from crying. When she saw her mother, she rushed into her arms. They said his oxygen levels dropped, Patricia said through tears. They've got him on a ventilator now. Mama, I'm so scared. Shh, baby. He's strong. He's going to be okay. Grace held her daughter tight, and Robert felt like he was intruding on a private moment. He started to back away, but Grace reached out and caught his hand. Patricia, this is Mr. Chen. He gave me a ride. Patricia wiped her eyes and seemed to recognize Robert. You're the man from the news. The trial. Yes, Robert said simply. Mom's been helping you, Patricia said. It wasn't quite a question, but there was something protective in her tone. She's been saving me, Robert corrected. Your mother is the most capable person I've ever met. A doctor came out, and they all turned anxiously. Are you the family of Tommy Williams? Yes, Grace and Patricia said together. He's stable for now. The ventilator is helping him breathe, and we've adjusted his medications. You can see him 2 at a time, but only for a few minutes. Grace and Patricia hurried after the doctor. Robert sat down in the waiting room, feeling helpless. Around him, other families waited for news about their loved ones. Some were crying, some were praying, some just stared at the walls with exhausted expressions. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, walked up to him. Are you sad? She asked innocently. Robert managed to smile. A little worried about a friend. My brother is sick too, the girl said. But Mommy says the doctors here are really good. They'll make him better. I hope so, sweetheart. The girl's mother called her back, apologizing to Robert for the interruption. But the child's innocent faith somehow made Robert feel a little better. Grace came back about 20 minutes later, looking exhausted but slightly relieved. He's sleeping. They say the next few hours are critical, but his vital signs are improving. That's good news. Grace nodded, then looked around the waiting room as if seeing it for the first time. This is the children's hospital your foundation helped fund, isn't it? Robert looked around and realized she was right. 3 years ago, His foundation had donated $15 million to this hospital for new equipment and a wing expansion. He'd toured the facility once for a ribbon-cutting ceremony but hadn't been back since. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is. The doctor said they have one of the best pediatric intensive care units in the state now. Said they got new ventilators and monitoring equipment a few years back that have saved dozens of lives." Grace's voice cracked. "Your foundation did that. Your money did that. And now it's helping my grandson." Robert felt emotion welling up in his chest. All these months he'd been fighting to clear his name, fighting to avoid prison, fighting to salvage his reputation. But he'd lost sight of why any of it mattered. This was why. This little boy breathing with the help of equipment his foundation had provided. This was the real impact of his work. "Vincent wants to take all of that away," Robert said quietly. "If he succeeds in framing me, the foundation will collapse. The board will dissolve it. All the projects we're funding will stop." Grace took his hand. "Then we won't let him succeed." They stayed at the hospital until midnight. Tommy's condition stabilized, and the doctors said he was past the worst of it. Patricia insisted Grace go home and rest for the trial, promising to call if anything changed. In the car on the way back, Grace was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mr. Chen, can I ask you something?" "Of course. And please call me Robert." "Robert," Grace said, testing out the name. "Why did you start the foundation? Was it for tax purposes, like the prosecutor said?" Robert thought about it. He'd been asked this question dozens of times by reporters, by board members, by business partners. He usually gave a polished answer about corporate responsibility and giving back to the community. But sitting in this car, driving through the dark streets with this woman who'd shown him more loyalty than anyone in his life, he told the truth. "When I was 7 years old," he began, "my little sister got sick, leukemia. My parents weren't wealthy. We lived in a tiny apartment in Chinatown. My father worked in a restaurant. My mother sewed clothes. They couldn't afford the treatment she needed." Grace listened silently. There was a charity hospital that took her in, doctors who treated her for free, nurses who stayed late to make sure she was comfortable. She went into remission because of those people. She's alive today, living in California with her own family, because someone decided to help a poor immigrant family who couldn't pay. "So you wanted to be that someone for other families?" Grace said softly. "Yes. When I made my first million, then my first billion, I kept thinking about those doctors and nurses. I wanted to make sure other families wouldn't have to watch their children suffer because they couldn't afford help." Robert's voice was thick with emotion. "And now Vincent is trying to make it look like I stole from those families. Like I took money meant for sick children. It's the one thing I would never ever do." "I know," Grace said. "I've always known." The next morning they were back in court. Robert had barely slept, running on coffee and determination. Grace looked tired too, but her eyes were sharp and alert. The IT access logs had been delivered to the court. Judge Harrison reviewed them carefully before the jury was brought in. "These logs are interesting," the judge said. "Mr. Chen, would you like to present your findings?" Robert stood, holding the documents. His hands were steady now. "Your Honor, these logs show that on every date when suspicious transfers occurred, there was no authorized remote access request from Vincent Liu. However, there were unauthorized login attempts using my credentials from an IP address that matches Mr. Liu's home." Morrison jumped up. "Unauthorized attempts don't prove Mr. Liu succeeded in accessing the system. They do when they're followed immediately by successful logins and fund transfers," Robert countered. "The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. Someone at Mr. Liu's address was trying to hack into the system using my stolen credentials, and within minutes of gaining access, money was moved." The jury was paying very close attention now. Several of them were taking notes. "Furthermore," Robert continued, feeling more confident, "I'd like to call attention to something else in these logs. On 3 separate occasions, these unauthorized access attempts happened while I was provably somewhere else. I have security footage from my building showing me in the gym, at a restaurant, and at a charity event. There's no way I could have been making these transfers." Grace had found those details the night before, cross-referencing the dates with Robert's calendar and building security footage. It was meticulous work that had taken hours, but it was paying off now. Morrison requested a recess to review the evidence. Judge Harrison granted it. During the break, Robert saw Vincent in the hallway, talking urgently on his phone. When Vincent noticed Robert looking at him, his expression changed. The calm, confident demeanor was cracking. Grace nudged Robert. He's scared. Good. Scared people make mistakes. When court reconvened, Morrison's entire strategy had shifted. Your Honor, the prosecution requests to recall Vincent Liu to the stand. Vincent walked back up, and Robert noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The man who had seemed so composed before now looked nervous. Morrison questioned him about the IP addresses and the access logs. Vincent tried to explain them away, saying maybe someone had hacked his home network, or maybe the logs were wrong, or maybe there was a technical error. But with each weak excuse, he looked less credible. The jury's expressions had changed from certainty of Robert's guilt to doubt about Vincent's innocence. Then it was Robert's turn to question him again. Grace whispered, "Ask him about the deposits. The irregular ones in his bank account." Robert stood and looked directly at Vincent. For 12 years, this man had pretended to be his friend, had eaten meals at his table, had celebrated promotions and bonuses, and all the while he'd been planning this betrayal. "Vincent," Robert said, his voice cold now, "let's talk about your personal finances." Vincent shifted uncomfortably. "What about them?" "You've had several large deposits into your personal account over the past year. Deposits that don't come from your salary or any legitimate source I can identify. Where did that money come from?" "That's private. Not when you're accusing me of stealing." "Where did it come from?" Vincent's lawyer, sitting in the gallery, looked worried. Vincent licked his lips. "Investments. I made some good investments." "What investments specifically?" "I don't remember off the top of my head." "You don't remember receiving $20,000? Robert's voice rose. "Vincent, that money started appearing in your account at exactly the same time money started disappearing from the foundation. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence?" "I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment right," Vincent said suddenly. The courtroom gasped. The Fifth Amendment protected people from self-incrimination. If Vincent was innocent, why would he need to protect himself? Judge Harrison frowned. "Mr. Liu, you're a witness, not a defendant. However, you have the right to refuse to answer questions that might incriminate you, but I'm warning you, the jury will draw their own conclusions from your silence." "I understand," Vincent said quietly. Robert looked at the jury. He could see it in their faces. The doubt about his guilt had transformed into suspicion about Vincent's role. They weren't sure what the truth was yet, but they were no longer certain that Robert was the villain in this story. "No further questions," Robert said and sat down. Grace squeezed his hand under the table. They hadn't won yet, but the battle was turning in their favor. As court adjourned for the day, Morrison approached Robert in the hallway. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept well either. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, away from the reporters, "I need to review this case further. There are questions now that need answers." "Questions you should have asked before you charged me," Robert said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Perhaps." Morrison looked him in the eye. "But if Vincent Liu has committed fraud, I want to know. Justice means finding the truth, not just winning cases." It was the first time anyone from the prosecution had suggested Robert might be innocent. It felt like a small victory. That evening, as Robert and Grace prepared for the next day, Grace's phone rang with good news. Tommy was off the ventilator and breathing on his own. He was going to be okay. Grace cried with relief, and Robert found himself crying too. For Tommy, for Grace, for everything this woman had sacrificed to help him. "Thank you," he said when they'd both composed themselves. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," Grace said, wiping her eyes. "We still have work to do. But we're going to win this, Robert. We're going to show everyone the truth." And looking at this incredible woman who'd come into his life when he needed her most, Robert believed her. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected place. It was 3 a.m, and Robert couldn't sleep. He sat in his office going through old emails, old documents, anything that might help. Grace had gone home hours ago to check on Tommy, who was recovering well but still in the hospital. Robert's eyes were burning from staring at the computer screen, but he kept searching. There had to be something, some piece of evidence that would definitively prove Vincent was behind everything. Then he found it, not in the financial records or the access logs, in something much simpler. An old email from 2 years ago. It was from Vincent to Robert discussing a potential investment opportunity in the Cayman Islands. Robert remembered getting the email but declining the investment because it seemed too risky. What he hadn't noticed at the time was the email signature. Vincent had included his personal email address along with his work email. Robert's heart started racing. He opened a new browser window and started searching. That personal email address appeared in several places online: business forums, investment groups, and then, buried deep in the search results, something interesting: a business registration document from the Cayman Islands, a shell company called Lighthouse Holdings, registered 18 months ago. The registered agent's email? Vincent's personal email address. Robert checked the foundation's financial records again, his hands shaking. Lighthouse Holdings. There it was. One of the shell companies that the prosecution claimed Robert had set up to funnel stolen money. Except Robert had never heard of it until the trial, but Vincent had created it 2 years ago using his personal email, and somehow he'd made it look like Robert was behind it. Robert grabbed his phone and called Grace, not caring that it was the middle of the night. She answered on the third ring, her voice groggy. "Robert, what's wrong?" "I found it. I found the proof we need." "What? What did you find?" He explained about the email, the shell company, the registration documents. Grace was fully awake now, asking sharp questions, making sure he'd documented everything. "Print it all," she said. "Every page. We'll bring it to court tomorrow. This is big, Robert. This could be the evidence that breaks the case open." "Should I call Morrison? Tell her what I found?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "No, not yet. Let's present it in court, in front of the jury. If we give it to Morrison first, she'll have time to prepare a counter-argument. We want Vincent to be surprised." "Grace, you think like a lawyer." "I think like someone who's had to fight for every single thing in her life," she corrected. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day." But neither of them slept much. By 6 in the morning, they were both at Robert's apartment, going over the documents, planning their strategy. Grace made breakfast while Robert organized the evidence. It felt surreal, this billionaire and this housekeeper working together like partners. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said while they ate. "Why do you still work as a housekeeper? Your children are grown and successful. You could retire, travel, relax." Grace smiled, sipping her coffee. "You think cleaning houses is beneath me?" "No, that's not what I meant. I know what you meant." Grace's smile widened. "And the truth is, I like my work. I like making things clean and orderly. I like the simplicity of it. You start with a mess, you clean it up, and at the end of the day, you can see what you've accomplished. Not many jobs give you that kind of immediate satisfaction. I never thought of it that way. Most people don't. They see housekeepers as invisible. We come in, we clean, we leave. But we see everything. We notice things. We understand how people live when they think nobody's watching." Grace looked at him seriously. "That's how I knew you were innocent, Robert. I've cleaned for rich people who were truly corrupt. I've seen how they treat their staff, how they talk on the phone, what they leave lying around. You're not like that. You always said please and thank you. You asked about my family. You left generous tips at Christmas. Those are small things, but they matter. They show character." Robert felt a lump in his throat. "I wish I'd paid more attention to you before all this. Really gotten to know you." "We know each other now," Grace said simply, "and that's what matters." At the courthouse, the mood was different.